You know, when we think about industrial progress, we usually picture these amazing things, right? Towering factories, incredible new technologies. But there's a flip side to that coin, a much darker side. And that story, well, it's written in the tragedies that have completely reshaped our world.
So in this explainer, we're going to take a journey through a whole century of these industrial disasters. What we're looking for are the patterns, the things that keep happening over and over again, and the consequences that linger for generations. We'll go from the soot-choked cities of the past all the way to the invisible poisons of today to really get at the true cost of all this progress.
All right, so let's start at the beginning. The Industrial Revolution. It promised us this incredible new era of prosperity, right? A future literally built on steel and steam. But what it also did was introduce brand new and often totally unseen dangers into our communities. And that created this tension, a push and pull that honestly still defines our world today.
And people saw this right away. I mean, even early on, critics were describing cities with scorched, blackened trees and these disgusting slime pools. So yeah, this was hardly some pristine new world. For a lot of people, it was a landscape of pure filth and danger. And this is the core of it, right? This tension between let's grow the economy and the very real cost to human life and the environment. It really sets the stage for everything that comes next. And it makes you wonder, what's the price of progress? How much are we willing to pay?
Okay, so let's jump forward to the early 20th century. Here, the dangers get, well, raw and explosive. We're talking about disasters starting deep in the earth and literally rising up to choke the air people were breathing.
So check this out, because this is a really fascinating contrast between two totally different kinds of industrial threats. On one hand, you have Courrier, France, an instant, violent, fiery catastrophe deep in a coal mine. Then, fast forward about 50 years to London. Here, it's not an explosion. It's this slow, silent, suffocating disaster. It was caused by something called a temperature inversion, basically a weather fluke that trapped all the city's coal smoke right at street level, like a toxic blanket. Two very different disasters, right? But what's the common thread? They both came from the exact same source, our total reliance on coal.
1,099. That's how many miners lost their lives in the Courrier's disaster. It's still Europe's worst mining accident. And here's the really tragic part. Miners had reported smoke and gas before the blast. They knew something was wrong. But work continued, and then a massive explosion of coal dust just tore through over 100 kilometers of tunnels.
And then there's this number, 12,000. That's the estimated number of people who died because of London's Great Smog in 1952. Just imagine that. For 5 whole days, this bizarre weather pattern just trapped all the city's pollution, creating a toxic fog so thick it choked thousands to death. It was a silent killer, and it was so shocking that it directly led to the famous Clean Air Act of 1956.
So, the London smog showed everyone just how dangerous the stuff coming out of our smokestacks could be. But a few decades later, a small community in America was about to discover a threat that was, in some ways, even more terrifying. Because this time, the poison wasn't in the air. It was buried right under their feet. And this timeline, it just lays it all out. It's like a slow-motion car crash. For about a decade, a chemical company dumps thousands of tons of toxic waste into this old canal. Then, get this, they cover it up with dirt and sell the land to the local school board for $1, just $1. Years go by, a school is built, houses go up. Then, after some heavy rain in the late 70s, this chemical ooze starts seeping into basements, backyards, even the school playground. Suddenly, you have a federal emergency and the birth of the Superfund Act, which was designed to make polluters pay for their mess. It's just a perfect and perfectly awful example of how industrial waste can be a ticking time bomb.
But this story isn't just about chemicals bubbling up from the ground. It's about the people who fought back. This was a true grassroots movement, led mostly by mothers, women like Lois Gibbs, who just refused to be ignored. They were the ones who went door to door, creating their own health surveys to show the patterns of sickness in their neighborhood. They protested, they shouted, they even held a couple of government officials hostage for a few hours. They forced the world to pay attention and to see this for what it was. Not some random act of nature, but a disaster created by a company.
Which brings us to what is widely considered the single worst industrial disaster in history. We're moving to Bhopal, India in 1984, just a few years after Love Canal. This event would show the world, on an absolutely horrifying scale, what happens when a whole series of safety failures line up just right and unleash an invisible killer on a sleeping city.
More than 500,000 people. Let that sink in.
Over 500,000 people were exposed to this cloud of incredibly toxic gas that leaked from a pesticide plant. Thousands died almost instantly, but the real horror of Bhopal is how the death and suffering just kept going for years and years and years.
And this is the key thing to understand. This was not a freak accident. It was a complete and total cascade of failures. Every single safety system that should have stopped this leak was either broken, turned off, or just wasn't good enough. The refrigeration unit that was supposed to keep the chemical stable switched off to save money. The flare tower that was supposed to burn off any escaping gas, it was down for maintenance. The vent scrubber that was supposed to neutralize the gas, also not working. It wasn't one thing that went wrong, it was everything that went wrong. It was a disaster that was practically inevitable.
But like I said, the real horror of Bhopal wasn't just what happened that night. It was the way the poison lingered, echoing down through families. We have a term for this now, intergenerational impact. And Bhopal is the most devastating example of it.
And this chart really brings home that unseen legacy. A study from just last year found something incredible. They looked at men who were still in their mother's womb during the disaster. 15 years later, those men had a significantly higher risk of having a disability that affected their ability to get a job. Just think about that. The poison literally reached across time, through the womb, and marked children before they were even born, casting a shadow over their entire lives.
So, we've looked at a coal mine in France, a toxic fog in London, a buried chemical dump in America, and a gas leak in India. They're all so different, but what are the common threads? What lessons can we pull from these shadows of disaster?
Well, a few things really stand out. First, in almost every case, there were ignored warnings. People knew there was a risk, but nothing was done. Second, you see the incredible power of community activism. Think of the homeowners at Love Canal. They showed that regular people can force governments to act. And that action often leads to landmark laws, like the Clean Air Act or the Superfund Act. These disasters literally wrote our environmental rulebook. But we also learned about these horrifying generational health effects and saw the birth of the environmental justice movement, the recognition that so often it's working-class communities that bear the brunt of this pollution. It's a tragic pattern, but it's also a powerful story of people fighting back.
And that brings us to the big question, doesn't it? These tragedies shaped our laws. They shaped our world. They gave us the Clean Air Act and the Superfund and forced a conversation about corporate responsibility. But here's the thing. Have they really changed our fundamental calculation of risk versus progress? We've gotten really good at reacting to disasters, but if we actually learned how to prevent them? When you think about the challenges we're facing today, climate change, AI, you name it, it makes you wonder, are we just doomed to repeat the same mistakes, or can we finally learn the lessons that were paid for in such a terrible, terrible price?